Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Corporate Finance, Step Up and Embrace Automation. This event is being presented by CFO Daily News and is being sponsored by Auditoria. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speakers, Elaine, Nowak, and Wayne Butterfield.
Hi, thanks so much, Ty. So we're super excited to be here today. Wayne, super excited to have you with us as we talk about some of the results from this study that we had put out. As for myself, I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Auditoria, and I really work to develop and articulate compelling value propositions and targeted content. And I do that by working with thought leaders, industry and subject matter experts, and analysts to communicate the benefits and value of auditoria.com and auditoria.ai, I should say, and any kind of automation software that's out there today, and ways in which we can automate the back office and really have a customer-centric finance transformation. Wayne, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, hi guys, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking alongside the queen of webinars here, Elaine. So yeah, my name's Wayne Butterfield. As you can see, I'm actually on the other side of the pond, so it's a little late here in the UK, but great to be here. I'm global head of intelligent automation solutions for an American firm, interestingly called ISG. My role really is helping clients to make use of these technologies. I'm an industry veteran. I've been in and around the automation space in the enterprise as a really early adopter of RPA and other technologies. Yeah, it's almost a decade now since I bought my first RPA licenses. So pleasure to be here. Really look forward to sharing some of the insights and obviously digging into some of the polls that we've got coming up with the audience as well.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the survey itself. So again, this was the tipping point, the state of automation in the back office was the survey that we had done. We surveyed actually more than 600 finance professionals to understand what is happening in terms of automation in the back office. And when we looked into some of the results, and did a little bit more of a deep dive into the responses that we got, we realized that, you know, when we look at this corporate finance back office, tasks that take up the most time, we talked a little bit about, you know, got the results to say, what were those tasks? What were the biggest challenges in the finance back office? And then what is the current and hopefully the future state of automation in finance? I think the overall arching theme and why we called it the tipping point is because it really came down to finance shedding this reputation that it has, that they're really slow to adopt new technology. And what we really need to see from the back office is a way to streamline their processes and all the work that they do that's still really quite manual. So I think having said that, we're going to kick it off with our first poll question to just sort of see how closely aligned the audience that we have today is to some of the responses that we asked on the survey. So the first question, you'll see it pop up. What are the overall challenges across the finance back office? So 5 responses that you could come forward with. Is it time spent on repetitive tasks? Is that where your biggest overall challenge is? Is it time spent using tools that no longer work? Is it inaccurate or outdated processes? Maybe it's time spent checking and updating data. And lastly, is your overall challenge the lack of resources to invest in technology? So Wayne, what are your thoughts on this poll question and what some of the responses you think could be like the #1 challenges?
Well, although my background's actually telco, it's interestingly over the last 4 years, just about every client I've worked with at least at some time their finance department. And I would say that, you know, I'd be really interested in understanding any organization that isn't spending plenty of time on repetitive tasks in their finance business. So I would be really surprised if we don't have a big swing towards #1. Yeah, interestingly, probably I would say that #4 point, time spent checking and updating data. Many a finance team I've certainly worked with live and breathe Excel. and data quality always still seems to be a real challenge, at least in those businesses that I've worked with.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think data is always the thing. Clean data, updated data, siloed data, all those kinds of things. Data in disparate systems, and how do you get the right, source of truth for what it is that you're trying to solve? So the poll should be closing up just about now, and we can see the results that came up. And not surprisingly, there you go. The two top ones seem to align. So let's share the results that we got from the survey to also show. So right on the money there, Wayne, number one was time spent on repetitive tasks. So really I think especially in the back office, there is a lot of work that is the same thing over and over. If you think about finance is very cyclical, you've got month close, you've got quarter close, year close. So they always know the tasks that have to get done day to day, and all these different time increments. So it's not a surprise that there are things that get over and over repeated, repetitive tasks, right? And then a quick follow-up on that number two, time spent checking and updating data. So yeah, that the data is a big area. I think even talking about, we look at what happens with the pandemic, right? It's accelerated digital transformation. We hear a lot about collaboration tools that have really taken the forefront, right? People are having to find ways to work together, even though everyone was remote or at home or working from their home or some other remote location, right? But I still think that the corporate back office has essentially remained unchanged, that it was still a lot of manual work. So any thoughts on the results here?
Well, I'm pleased to say, although I'm not a fortune teller, that I was bang on the money. And as I say, the data point I can't stress enough. The amount of amalgamation and changing of data cleansing that I've seen over the years. I just don't know how or why it hasn't been fixed earlier. It's such a challenge I see in so many different organizations, and that's why people are spending the time on the repetitive tasks. They're having to cleanse the same data all of the time, and that's where a lot of this repetitive task comes from, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of this repetitive task also when it comes to communicating. So how do I get my data? Sometimes it's in a system, sometimes it's with somebody else in a different department, or it's with another stakeholder within the company, maybe it's with someone outside the company. So there's a lot of back and forth, I think, to communication that happens. When we think about compliance related activities, monthly close activities, all these things I was talking about, quarterly and annually reporting, it's the same thing. It's cyclical. It's over and over again. So when we look at some of these other findings that we found in the study, is your finance back office sufficiently automated? More than half, 58% said nope, not automated. When we asked and we said, how many of your team's tasks are automated? It was about 78% less than half their tasks are automated. So in understanding that statistic, that's huge. That's 3/4 of the people that we surveyed said that less than half the things they do were automated. So I think there's really an overwhelming number of tasks and processes that have to get done. It's putting this undue stress on the finance teams, given the number of manual, repetitive things that they're doing and they need to perform on a daily basis. What are your thoughts on some of these stats? What advanced technologies do you use in the finance office? 37% don't use advanced technologies.
Mm-hmm. And again, I think if you imagine, and probably going back to the earlier poll, one of the questions was, some of our systems don't work. How many of us say that our systems don't work? It feels like the vast majority of work that unfortunately is having to happen in finance is because the systems are not necessarily giving them the data or the right data format or completing the tasks that many of these systems probably should. And some of them are particularly old as well. And if you think about where you usually invest a lot of your money in new technology, probably not in your finance department. So it's not really a surprise that we're not using advanced technologies. And if we're not using advanced technologies within the finance department, it's probably not so much of a surprise that there's not that much automation and obviously, many of the tasks that we complete are still being completed in a very manual way. Now, I think that the tide is starting to turn. Certainly with the with intelligent automation technologies actually being tools that can be used by finance professionals as well as automation experts. So maybe the tide is starting to turn, but 2021 in the tipping point, it hasn't quite reached that tipping point yet.
Yes, yes. And I think it's interesting too, that last statistic on the bottom, functions with the most manual work. So if we think about all the different parts of the back office and the finance back office, and they said accounts payable, a third said accounts payable was the most manual, and followed right behind by a fourth said it was accounts receivable. And that was comparing it to things like, finance, financial planning and analysis, or is it auditing, or all these other areas in the back office. And I think that's not a surprise. I see that statistic as actually, it's what I would expect as well, because those areas, AP, AR, they've got the individual follow-up they have to do. They've always got to be reaching out to customers, to their vendors. They've got to be parsing and extracting insights from, unstructured documents like invoices and contracts and tax forms. So it's no surprise that those areas are really very manual still. And the thing is, there is technology that's out there that's available to help automate that kind of work. And I think to your point, we're starting to see that organizations are like, yep, there's digitization that's out there. There's transformation that can happen. How do I get on board? How do I make that happen? And I think we'll get to that a little later in the webinar, specifically around that. But I would definitely say, 5 years ago, when you would talk about RPA, most people didn't know what it meant. And nowadays, they at least know what it means. Now, how many of them are using it or putting it in place, that's still, to be determined. And I think it's definitely a place that the back office could step forward more in. Maybe not at the tipping point yet, as you said, but we're getting closer for sure in the back office. Okay, so that brings up our second poll question for today. Let's talk about things like how much time it takes, okay, and looking at that back office. So how much time does your team spend following up, seeking approvals, requesting documentation, communicating with vendors, customers, and internal stakeholders each week? So is it less than an hour a week you do all this kind of follow-up and approval work? Is it 1 to 5 hours a week that your team and your time is spent? Is it 6 to 10 hours a week? Is it greater than 10 hours? And then we also threw one out there, it doesn't apply to me. Maybe you don't spend your time doing following up or seeking approvals or requesting documentation and communicating with all these different kinds of stakeholders. So thoughts on this one, Wayne? Where do you think we're going to fall in terms of our audience polling and how much time it takes for them?
I think this is a really tricky one to answer on the poll, and I'll tell you the reason why. Probably twofold. The first one is what role is somebody doing? And obviously, different roles within finance will have this as a core capability. So it really depends on the audience to some degree. And then I would say the fact that we have spent most of our time in a remote setting for so long now, and how good your workflow is. How much of this would you have been able to do pre-COVID? With a tap on the shoulder to the guy sat next to you, or a quick shout over the desk, versus now. Obviously, everything needs to be, a call, an email, some official way of actually engaging with a person. So it wouldn't surprise me if we've actually seen, an increase in this. And again, I'm going to go probably somewhere in the region, maybe 1 to 5 hours, perhaps. That individuals are looking in this, and I am thinking through a kind of COVID lens. So wouldn't surprise me again if it was 6 to 10 hours even, because we are talking here about a week, not a day. So wouldn't surprise me, Elaine. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking if we look at the 6 to 10 hours, just because even if they spent an hour a day doing this kind of work, then that's like 8 hours a week, right? And I could see that, or no, my math is wrong. That would be 5 hours if it was an hour a day in a work week, right? I'm thinking a full week. Nobody wants to work on Saturday and Sunday. So then maybe if it's more than that, if it was 2 hours a day, then that would be more like 10 hours. But I think that seems excessive. But let's close out the poll and see what kind of results we have coming up. Okay, so results show 6 to 10 hours. So kind of where we were. And again, 6 to 10 hours, that's a big range in terms of if something takes only 6 hours, that's a little over an hour a day. If it's 10 hours, that's more like 2 hours a day. That's a significant portion of your day. So let's look at what came in the tipping point survey. And I think it's sort of interesting because this is the second annual time that we put out the survey. And the results that came in from 2020, I think it's a significant statistical difference with what we're seeing in 2021. And I think to your whole point, Wayne, with the whole pandemic and looking at it through that lens, it sort of lends itself to what some of these changes might be. So if I were to highlight, I think one of the biggest changes and a significant one is if we look at 2020, almost 40%, it was less than an hour a week that they spent doing this kind of follow-up, getting the approvals, less than an hour a week, right? 40%. Compare that to 2021 survey. Now we've been in the pandemic for over a year, and all of a sudden that less than an hour dropped all the way down to 5%. Super significant jump, I believe. Thoughts on that?
I guess not a surprise.
Right.
Completely agree that it's got to be pandemic related. If I just think about how rammed everyone's diary has been, I've got personal friends in the kind of finance world, and we were speaking at a barbecue the other day, and they were just saying, we've started to go back in the office, and just things are just so much easier to get done when you're in that same space, because you are not having to book time in someone's diary or just hope that when you phone them they're going to pick up, because you can actually see that hour meeting only lasted 23 minutes because they're now not on the phone. So it's not a surprise. And I think that definitely is one of the drawbacks, although there are many benefits of working from home, and I've certainly benefited from that. There are business reasons and business challenges that have, I think, grown as a result of this. And many of them, I think, under the surface, Elaine, you wouldn't necessarily, without this survey, you wouldn't have even probably known that this would have been a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my dog loves that I'm home. Super happy that I'm here all the time, so there's the benefit. But definitely the challenge of it's almost like if you want to get something done, a quick answer, you've got to schedule that time. You have to physically get on a calendar, get onto some kind of collaboration tool to try to find that person. And you can't even see if they're there necessarily. Only that green dot might tell you whether or not they're around, right? So you may not know. And then I think the other significant stat that I'm going to highlight here was this stat, which is about the 10-hour plus. So you mentioned it a little bit, Wayne. You said potentially that could be something. I think it's a surprising statistic how much of a difference it was. In 2020, only 8% said they spent more than 10 hours. And in 2021, same question, 20%. That's, okay, again, doing math, that's a fifth of the people that we surveyed said greater than 10 hours. Now that we don't even know that could be 11 hours, that could be 50 hours. We don't even know how many hours it could be. Maybe people spend the majority of their time now following up, getting approval, requesting the documentation, communicating. So thoughts around this particular statistic and the change here. Again, I think it's along the similar lines, but what are your thoughts, Wayne?
Yeah, again, I think it's just a worrying statistic for those 20% of people that, having to chase and hurry people for updates, for approvals, etc., is not exactly the most rewarding task.
No.
But for me as an automation professional, I'm thinking, right, how much of that can we actually automate, and actually how much bigger benefit is it now? 20% of people over 10 hours is a lot of effort on probably not that much reward. It's certainly not a rewarding task. So the kind of automation guru in me sees that as a great opportunity. But also I do feel sorry for those people who are literally having to spend that much time a week on chasing people down.
I would have to agree. So that brings us to our next poll question. I think on this one, let's get into a little bit more specific around what that follow-up might look like, what those tasks that are being done and taking up the bulk of a lot of people's time now. So what are your primary day-to-day challenges? So again, we're going to get the pulse of the audience here. Is it, number one, inaccurate or partially complete information that you get from your vendors and your customers? I mean, how frustrating when there's a form they got to fill out, they leave something off, you don't realize till the form comes in, you got to send it back out, you got to request that information, you got to follow up on incoming. Very frustrating. I could see that one being a big one. Maybe it's a lack of responsiveness from internal employees and vendors and customers. So you send something out and you don't get anything back, or it's like a black hole, and your email goes nowhere, and you still have to keep following up to find out what's going on. And that, I think, that lack of responsiveness, is it the bigger challenge than the repetitive follow-ups? Or maybe it's these questions that come in from your customer and vendors. And maybe it's the same question you get over and over again. Could you send me a copy of the invoice, please? As if you hadn't sent it out 3 times already. But those kinds of questions still take up your time. Someone's got to monitor that email box. Someone's got to respond to those questions and move forward. Number 4, time wasted on getting approvals to take action. So again, if there's an approval process where in order for something to be released or something to be extended or something to be increased, whether it's a credit limit or something to this to that point, is that where your day-to-day challenges are? And is that your primary challenge? And then lastly, is it, again, going back to what you're using in terms of how you're handling your day-to-day, is it that you have difficulty because your tools are outdated and the processes that you're doing are outdated, and so that makes it tough for you to complete your job? So again, poll question 3, what are your primary day-to-day challenges? Inaccurate or partially complete info? Is it lack of responsiveness? Is it the repetitive follow-ups and questions? Is it time wasted on approvals, or is it difficulty because of your outdated tools? We'll let the poll go on for another few seconds here. And Wayne, okay, once again, get out your crystal ball. What do you think is going to be the key challenges on the day-to-day?
I think all of these really have got merit. I think it's really difficult to really say, oh, it's going to be this one or this two. I'd be really surprised if there is any that is really prevalent. But I guess kind of lack of responsiveness from people in general, and that's only because, again, you're busy, you're on Zooms, Teams meetings constantly. So I would think that's probably one. And then again, because you're not necessarily there in person, I'd be really surprised if repetitive follow-ups and questions also doesn't kind of really shine here. And again, it's because we're having the way that we're having to communicate. It's so much easier to verbally communicate, clear up any grey area on a quick 2-minute conversation by the water cooler. Much more time consuming when you're having a Teams conversation while already in another Zoom meeting. And so, these things just elongate. So again, I think most of these things would be would probably score quite well with most, but certainly responsiveness because everyone's so busy, and obviously repetitive queries because we're struggling to some degree at least in clarifying exactly what we need first time is also high up there, I guess.
Yeah, and they're so interrelated too. I think that to your point, it's probably going to be pretty equal just because they all lead to each other, right? So a lack of responsiveness, or maybe you get the inaccurate and then you reach back out and then you have to follow back up. And so I think there's a lot of sort of interrelated, all these kind of challenges are sort of interrelated in that way as well. And I can't say how many times when I didn't get a response from someone from an email, I would get up out of my chair, go down the hall, go pop up by their cubicle, put my head over, be like, hey, I just needed a quick answer on this, And that's the kind of interaction that makes it easy to kind of get the response or get an answer from something. And that's kind of something we miss when we're in this remote environment. So we'll close out the poll question now, see what kind of results we get. And okay, there you go. Pretty similar to what we saw on the actual poll, that lack of responsiveness and the repetitive follow-up. So it's when your email goes into you reach out and no one answers you. Okay, so that's definitely a factor there. And then the repetitive follow-up. So let's look at what we had on the survey when we asked 600 plus finance professionals, and no surprise there. I think a lot of these were anywhere between the 17 to 22 range, right? So pretty much what we were expecting. The areas that represented the biggest day-to-day challenges were lack of responsiveness from the internal employees, vendors, customers. And I think to your point, Wayne, remote work, You're no longer asking and passing, no trip down the hall. So you just need to schedule time for every little question or follow-up that you don't get a response to. And then I think that's partly why the next one up, 18%, this repetitive follow-ups, the questions that you don't get answered. So I think that, you know, we can sort of hone in the point that communication and this data input output, those are the key areas that could be improved, right? So the data speaks for itself. When I think you talked about this earlier, Wayne, what areas back office is not necessarily the one that's going to be prioritized to be automated. If you think about marketing or engineering or sales, even human resources, these are all departments that face similar challenges. They had a lot of repetitive tasks. They had a lot of work that was done manually. And now a lot more automation has been put in place in these areas. And I think that they've really embraced technology to improve processes. And I think the time has come that corporate finance and accounting departments really need to do the same. Your thoughts on this? I think, again, following up with that, the inaccurate, the difficulty, outdated. So I think you made your points, but anything
Yeah.
else?
No, well, again, I laugh at this because if I think now about how communication in general has probably evolved even through the pandemic, email used to be the stable platform that you would make contact in. Then it was probably phone, and now for me with my colleagues, it's all WhatsApp. I'm bypassing every other channel, and it's a quick WhatsApp, it's a quick SMS now. There's no kind of formal email. We've just kind of started to move from quite formal contact channels into less formal ones, and that's great for internal colleagues. It's strange if you start WhatsApping or SMSing a client, a customer,
So true.
asking them to pay up their invoice. So that's again another challenge that people will have, is that we have all these different communication channels on top of just email now. And if you're looking for a quick response, email probably isn't the channel that people are most responsive in right now. There may have been before, maybe it was FaceTime, then it was email. Now we have all these text-based digital channels on the mobile phone, and they're probably taking some kind of priority. So there's a bit of a hint for anyone who's trying to get hold of me or my colleagues.
Yeah.
Definitely text works.
Yeah, and we Slack, actually, it's now become a verb. I'll Slack you the information. I'll Slack you the file, or quick question, and you put it up in the Slack. At my previous company, it was Google Chats, right? So again, I think those interactive tools, but that only really works, to your point, internally. And over the years, I've become close to some of the customers that bought software that we had. I work quite closely with them. And maybe I got to the point where we shared mobile phone numbers, but that's certainly not the case across all the customers. And I think if I were to start sending text messages to every customer, yeah, that would sort of be not well perceived. So that still is the challenge, when email is going to have to be the go-to for that follow-up, and what that means in terms of communication. So I think we've talked about challenges quite a bit, quite in depth, looking at these areas that really could use some improvement. I think now let's sort of pivot back over to where we talk about what can be done with the current state. How do we take it forward and help the back office to automate processes? When we did the survey, it was undeniable. It would be most beneficial for this finance function if they could reduce those repetitive tasks, if they could reduce those manual tasks. And a good percentage, good portion of them, as you see here on the screen, said that those would be the areas that could really help out. And happily, when they were surveyed, the top priority for finance back office next year, 38% said invest in new technologies to improve processes. So I think that implementing technology, it's going to streamline processes. It's going to really allow professionals to focus on these higher level business tasks. And that's going to really elevate the role of the finance back office. And it's going to enable teams to be more efficient and more effective using technology to get rid of these clerical, manual, administrative type work that can easily be done with some of the advanced technology and software and bots and artificial intelligence and all that kind of advanced technology that's out there right now. And I think it really has come to the point, and I think it is a bit of a tipping point insofar as, when you have environments like today with the unpredictability that comes from things like we never expected to be working from home with COVID. A lot of companies had to be flexible. They had to pivot. I think automated technology and automation in general, it's no longer a nice to have. It's really become a need to have, and it's something that we need to do. So that the workplace of the future, it's going to be digital. And I think teams are looking to be more efficient and to sort of be more predictive in how work gets done. So I think that advanced technologies like intelligent process automation, machine learning, natural language processing, all this stuff is going to show up more and more in the back office. So I think at this point, let's talk a little bit about if you are an organization and you recognize the fact that you need to take your finance back office and put some automation in place, how do you do that? How do you move the back office forward and create this zero touch autonomous finance function? I would say what has to get done. So at this point, Wayne, tell us a little bit more. This is your expertise and area. So why don't we delve a little bit more deeply into how should automation play a role in your transformation?
Excellent. And I like to look at this kind of through three lenses, really. I call it discover, remove, improve. And what I mean by that is the best kind of start you can make is not necessarily to dive straight in and look piecemeal at individual tasks, but look holistically really at what it is that you're trying to achieve, within your finance department. Now, we all kind of know what the end goal is. And what's happened is over the years, that end goal has probably been quite similar. But the way that you actually achieve that over the years of change and process change and new regulations and new systems, new ways of working, there's been amalgamations of companies, it's just got to be, it turned into a real complex mess. And actually, that for me, really discover is the use of things like task mining, process mining, good old-fashioned lean, and also tapping into that knowledge of SMEs, really to understand what is it we're looking to achieve, how do we currently do that, and could we do that in a different way? And that amalgamation of technology, SME, and external expertise, really is a good way to start. And then that really helps you understand, okay, more of a strategic versus a tactical deployment. Remove, obviously, all about removing kind of waste, removing processes that are no longer there, really highlighting some of those areas. And at least what I found, in a number of departments is that a lot of this manual process that we're doing every month is because System A doesn't give us what System A should. And so we've created a manual workaround because the data that's coming out of System A isn't in the right format or doesn't include this. So we don't trust the data because back in 1986, there was a line that was wrong. So we created a process to make sure that that data was always thoroughly checked just in case something happened post. Now, that might have been an anomaly. But again, we still do that because this is the process and this is what's being written down. And so kind of removing some of this waste, rethinking about what we need to do, making sure actually that we're making use of a lot of the capabilities that the tools generally have. I mean, again, what I found over the years is that we may buy a tool or technology that has loads of capability, but we only ever unlock some of it. And actually, the tools that we may already have may actually have many of the functionalities. They may have later versions of their solutions that has more capability that we need. So really removing the waste, really thinking about the tools that we have and can we do more with them. And then I guess at the end of that, really, we start to get into this world of, okay, so we're comfortable with our review. We really understand what we're trying to achieve. We understand where we are at the moment. We understand where we could be with what we already have. We've removed waste where we see that. And now it's really open to what I would class as intelligent automation, hyper automation, depending which analyst you want to be speaking with. And if we just move on, I guess, to the next slide, Elaine, this should kind of help. So I already spoke about I call it process discovery, by the way. So there's a huge focus at the moment in the world of automation on a type of technology called process mining. Process mining is using the data exhaust out of your systems, and it's looking at data logs to find out what's going on at a transactional level, at a data level, transactional data level, and what's going on with your processes. And there's actually some really good examples in finance, and you mentioned AR and AP previously. There's some fantastic examples of process mining working really well in finance departments, because they see it's an elongated process. It could potentially be over many months. It could touch many different hands across a few different systems. Obviously, you've got approvals and this, that, and whatever. So it's a really elongated process. And actually being able to look at, often hundreds of thousands, millions of data points stretching back 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, gives you an incredible view of your process, probably for the first time ever, really. Because as much as we as SMEs can talk about how the process works, it's only when you really look at it through the lens of data and you add in pattern matching and other forms of AI on top of that, that you really see the process for what it actually is, not what you think it is. So really interesting area of technology. I mentioned process mining. There's also things like desktop analytics. So often we see piecemeal tasks that happen on a desktop that happen in Excel. And again, we don't often, as soon as we come out of a system, we lose this data trail because we're not in the system, we're not keying things in, we haven't got a login to Excel. Therefore, we kind of lose what actually happens within an end-to-end process. So things like desktop analytics, task mining, as it's probably now more commonly known, a different way of being able to see what's going on outside of a core system. And then things like process intelligence, again, really interesting point. Once you've got these process mining, task mining type tools kind of in situ, what they're doing is they're not just looking at historic data logs, they're actually looking at real-time data logs. So as something happens, an invoice comes in, is entered in the system, and say the approval limit is 100,000, and we know that that's not person A that needs to do that, it's actually person C. We could set a trigger so that because it's such a high invoice is already going straight to person C, slims down the amount of times. It's not necessarily automation per se, but it's using process intelligence. It's actually programming your process with an additional bit of intelligence, and it's using these data logs within your system to say, hey, I know when this happens, this is the step that needs to follow. And the reason why that's really important is because if you look at elongated processes, if you can cut down this step by a few days, this step by a week, this step by 2 days, in theory, from a customer perspective and from a chasing perspective, from a harassing other colleagues perspective, a lot of this automatic chasing is kind of done for you. And again, if we go back to the poll, we saw a load of kind of disgruntled employees who were pretty sick of having to chase and harass people, especially in this kind of COVID first world. So if you can get your process discovery, process intelligence and workflows aligned, again, it's all no code, low code in the main, and then you're on to a really good set of capabilities. And then once you've kind of done that, we then start to look at, okay, well, what's actually left of this manual work? And where can we replicate some of the capabilities that we have as finance professionals with technology? Now, I like to think about intelligent process automation as kind of a five-fold, and I will say these are the five main technologies that I talk about. They're not the only ones, but I think rather than bore every man and his dog with this full suite of capabilities that some are relevant, some aren't. It really depends on your industry. These five really are very relevant to just about every department in every organization, including many of our friends within finance. And I like to split intelligent automation kind of into two buckets. I call it handwork and head work. And what I mean by that is a lot of these kind of manual, repetitive tasks, they really are kind of on your keyboard and on your mouse. And they're things that you're doing with your hands. People talk about them being robotic type processes. You literally just hear the humdrum of your keyboard as you're keying in an invoice number from an invoice. You're approving something in SAP. It's very transactional, it's very hand heavy. But we'd be absolutely doing finance a disservice if we said that that's all that they do. They clearly don't. There's so much more that goes on. And so that's where the kind of head work comes in. So it's great that you can get the repetitive type robotic tasks completed with RPA. But actually, many of the things that we do, if you think about looking at an invoice, extracting information from that, reading an email, looking at a contract to try and pick out what the commercial term needs to be, reading the PO, etc., making a really complex decision about tax rules and which tax line a certain product or receivable needs to go against. Quite complex decisions that many of our friends in finance would say, they're complex, but I do them within a second.
Mm-hmm.
The brain is an amazing computer, but actually to replicate much of that experience and the technology is incredibly difficult, which is why we still all have jobs. And although you can kind of replicate many of these rule-based decisions, it's not that easy. You do need an incremental technology to be able to do that. And then lastly, and not least, making communicate. I mentioned before, this whole world of communication, digital communication, email in, email out, chatbots, conversational AI. And when you kind of add all of these things together, you've got your hand work and your head work. And I think that for me is what intelligent process automation is. And then, lastly, again, I kind of spoke about it, with the process intelligence, but the end-to-end, the closed loop for this with me is, okay, well, let's discover, remove, improve. Let's really understand what's going on. Let's use these technologies in order to create incremental value and hopefully, automate, remove waste, etc. But let's not just presume that we've actually added value. Let's use these same technologies. Let's use data to show the value that we've created so that we know we're tracking it. We're able to see this cost out. We're able to see the benefit that we've completed at a data level, not just a kind of on a spreadsheet, but actually seeing SLAs shorten, seeing times between approval, be shorter, and actually see that value, reduce month-end close from 7 days down to 5 days. Let's do that. That's the type of benefit that we would see through data, and of course, there's very likely to be hours back to the business. And then let's really get finance, not just looking at repetitive tasks. Let's get them actually analyzing and thinking about the future, not just having to worry about what's just happened. And I think that's the real value of all of this is that we can start to look forward versus look back.
Yeah, totally agree. So if we were to highlight some of those benefits that you talk about, putting in this technology, recognizing where automation can take the place of some of that hand work that you talked about, and allowing individuals to do a little bit more of that head work, the strategic kind of value-added tasks, I think that we could really take a step forward to move the back office forward. So I think the key highlights we want to talk about are the future-proof, how work gets done. So it's taking those legacy tasks and that kind of work that you do and allowing things like robotic process automation, maybe next generation bots to do that work instead. This is going to allow your teams, this data that gets collected, aggregated, it gets input by some kind of software and technology, means that you and your teams can make smarter, faster, and more precise decisions. And I think that's hugely important for what you said. Take closing down from 7 days to 5 days to 3 days even. How quickly can more things get done? And I think that's what leads to this idea of increasing the efficiencies. That's going to show you greater margins, and that's going to improve your cash performance, and it's going to help you get a better handle on what your cash position is if you can do things more quickly, and then you can make more strategic decisions about where you need to put your money, where you need to build your organization, and maybe do things like put it towards growth, or maybe it's research and development, or whatever it is that your organization needs. And then I think, to your point, if we talk about numbers, you put automation in place, you can recover thousands of hours annually in the back office. And I think things like that natural language processing, if you have an Alexa for finance, wouldn't that be great? That you could just sort of have a system that understands the language that comes in and what it can read. And I think it's really going to make your operations more efficient overall. So having said that, talked today quite a bit about some things. I hope that some of these, the thoughts that we had here, the conclusions we've come to can really help energize the finance back office professionals who have joined us today to understand there are many things out there that can help them to really digitize and transform the work that they do, where they spend their time, where their teams spend their time. So having kind of come to we're closing up here, I think we do have some time for questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ty and see if any questions came in while we were chatting today.
Thanks, Elaine. And now I'd like to take your questions. If you have questions, please submit them into the chat box now. So while we await those, one did come in while you were presenting. Our first question reads, what are some of the roadblocks to implementing technology?
Okay, so fair enough. I think we talked about how great it is to put technology in place. It's only fair to talk about some of the challenges that you might see when it comes to an implementation. I have some thoughts. Wayne, I'll go first, and then I will ask you, see what you think in terms of what could be some roadblocks. Having worked at software companies now for more than a decade, I think when you are considering a solution for your team, really look for something that's more out of the box ready, that has just a lot of configuration versus customizations. I think once you start doing customizations, that's where you get into trouble with scope increase, costs that increase, time to implementation always goes up when there's a lot more customization. So kind of look for technology that has a wide depth of offerings so that you can just really have a configuration for you. And then I think the other thing that's super important is you need to set clear and concise expectations. So make sure you are working with a vendor or a software company or whomever it is that you're working with. They do what we call injecting predictability into the process. So understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think Wayne, you talked a little bit about this earlier on. Just be very clear in what it is that you're trying to achieve, where you are now, what the future state looks like, and what you need to do to get there. So other thoughts on this, roadblocks to implementing technology?
For me, I always go down to people and process, and obviously the third wheel of that is technology. And what I've tended to find is actually the technology very rarely is at fault itself, and that those roadblocks really do kind of stem around people and process. And certainly something that I've seen. So think about your people, bring them on the journey. Okay, they will be the people who will be your biggest advocates or your worst enemy. So really do involve them. That's really key. And obviously, as I mentioned before, the whole kind of discover phase, to really understand your process. If you've got immature processes, if they are extremely mature but not very well documented or known outside of a few SMEs, you're really going to struggle, because you really do need to have good or well documented or well understood processes at least. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're going to be going down a bit of a rabbit hole quite quickly. And although that doesn't mean that you can't automate, what it means is that you're really going to be having to do a lot of rework as somebody in somewhere else in another department kind of recalls that every 10 times they have to do this, and before you know it, you're kind of constantly having to evolve an automation. And if you're having to do that, that's obviously more time, more money. So not ideal. Mm-hmm. So getting your processes right and well understood doesn't mean they have to be perfect, but they just have to be well understood early. And then, as I say, bringing your people on your journey, really two things for me, very key.
And I think also, just in terms of people, I've also found that you've really got to identify the champion, right? So who in the organization that's leading the project, the one who's taking the ownership and accountability for the project. And I think it's very important that organizations that take on a transformation and any kind of automation project really wants to make sure there's that one key person who is also going to help communicate across their internal organizations, that key stakeholder, that champion who's going to talk to others, make sure that they are reporting up to the executive level, make sure that they are working down for training at the user level. But a key champion, I think, is also another important one. And that can be a roadblock if you don't have a person that's really dedicated to bringing that project to life. So Ty, any other questions come in while we were chatting?
Yes, a few more did come in. Next question. When evaluating an automation solution, what are some of the requirements?
Okay, so Wayne, I'm going to let you go first on this one. What are your thoughts? So it's when you are evaluating, what are your requirements? So what do you look for in a solution?
Well, difficult one really. I always think this really depends on, again, on the eye of the beholder. So, again, understanding your own business really going to be quite key. What's your strategy? You on-prem, cloud? How much of this, how many of the tools do you literally have as mainframe versus SaaS? Do you use Citrix? Do you not? Is this a tactical fix? Do you have a long-term roadmap? What's your budget? Really interesting one there. Some of these technologies are absolutely fantastic, but if you don't have the budget, then really you need to be looking at alternative solutions. And I guess probably the other one that I would really add is what's the technical makeup of your team, and thinking about ease of implementation. And I really liked Elaine's point actually earlier on around kind of configuration versus kind of core platform coding changes, which you do then have to involve core IT. You're then up against every other IT project. So that ease of integration, implementation, really important, because I think that's really going to enable you to be self-sufficient, or as self-sufficient as you can be, versus reliant on other departments that will have their own roadmap and own priorities.
Absolutely agree with that 100%. And I think you have to look at software and understand one of the biggest things you're going to get. Okay, you got budget, you got this project approved. Now I want to know, we're investing this money, when are we going to see a return? That's always going to be, and especially for finance, right? There are people who understand why that question is being asked. When are we going to see the return on investment? So I think it's important to look at things like, what's the implementation timeline? How quickly can you get up and running? And then how do you, how long is it going to take? A year, 2 years until you're starting to see, I've invested this much into this technology. Now I'm actually starting to see the savings that was talked about. I'm starting to see the efficiencies that are being put in place. So, but understanding how long that's going to take before you start seeing that ROI, I think is super important. And I think another one that you really have to consider is the scalability. So if you're an organization, every organization wants to be profitable, they want to be growing, right? They want to continuously be, okay, we're here now, but we want to be here next year and the year after and so forth. So I think making sure you get a solution that can support your growth as an organization is another really important requirement when really evaluating the technology that's available out there. Okay, so I think we have time for one more. If there are any more questions that have come in, Ty, was there anyone else who had a question this afternoon for us?
Yes. Yep, there actually is one more question. Are there specific qualities you would recommend looking for when evaluating a technology vendor?
Okay, so we're very much into vendors, so like people are all about the automation today. Wayne, you have a thought on this, qualities for evaluating a technology vendor? What would you look for?
Key thing for me, I think I'm always a round peg, round hole type of guy. I think many vendors would, could turn their solution to work for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing. So I think really making sure that the vendor that you're choosing, that you're working with, kind of understands you, and actually their solution is designed to solve your problem, not could solve your problem if we did kind of X, Y, and Z. And again, in such a competitive market, there is obviously, that's certainly something that I'm aware of. You don't just want a jack of all trades. Generally, you want something that's going to really work for you. So I think really that for me is probably at least one of the key considerations. And I just like working with people that nice to get on with and really collaborative. I'm a very collaborative person myself, so I like teamwork, right? So if a vendor's difficult to work with, probably not going to be the easiest of things, especially as we mentioned before, kind of scalability long term, probably not ideal really. So find somebody that's good to work with, that has a product that really solves your problems, not just some generic problem that they will try and solve your problems with.
I totally agree. I think the word like partnership comes to mind, right? Make sure you find a solution provider that wants to partner with you, that it's not a buyer-seller relationship. It's more like we're going to go into this together, so that you get that continuous support even after the product goes live, that they have a customer value or customer success team that's going to continuously help you optimize your tools. And I think you even mentioned earlier, Wayne, like you put something in place. I think about Word, for example, right? I get it on my computer and I do the most basic thing with it, right? I'm not using some of that automated things that they even have in Word. I use a sliver of what its capabilities and functionalities are. So I think it's important, put technology in place and make sure that you have team members that are going to help you to get the most out of your product, to get the most from your investment. I think that's super key. And I absolutely agree with the second point. You want to look for tools that are much more specific. I mean, you can buy tools that are more like a Lego set, right? They're blocks, and they can build these blocks in any different way that you want in order to solve, or they could solve your problem, like you said, Wayne, right? But if you have tools that are much more specific, let's say for the finance function, that's going to go a much longer way to helping you get where you need to be more quickly. So if it's a tool that's very specific for the finance industry, I think that's going to be much better than having it be like a one-size-fits-all type technology or solution that's being put out there. So those are my thoughts on that, what to look for in evaluating a vendor. Okay, so I think that just about brings us up to the end of our session today. I've had a great time, actually. I thought it's been really fun, Wayne, getting your insights and talking about what we've seen, talking about the possibilities of the future where finance could be. And there's just we put up some information about our two companies, some contact information. If you're so inclined to learn some more about what Wayne does, what I do, what our software could do for you, by all means, please reach out. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Ty. Thank you for being a part of this. And we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Elaine. Thank you, Wayne. In order to remain on schedule, we'll respond to the rest of everyone's questions in a timely manner via email. So with that, on behalf of CFO Daily News, I would also like to thank everyone for attending. This concludes our program.